Welcome to another 21 Hats Dashboard, brought to you by our sponsor, The Great Game of Business. I'm Loren Feldman, and I'm here with Gene Marks. Welcome, Gene.
We're back, Loren. We're back.
Great to have you here. Gene, on Friday, the Supreme Court issued a ruling that I think is likely to get somewhat overlooked because it's kind of technical and there's a lot of other news swirling around right now, especially with regard, of course, to the presidential election. But this ruling involves regulation, and there have been a lot of predictions that this ruling has the potential to create regulatory chaos, including for small businesses. And that's because it overturns a concept that the Supreme Court established in, I think, 1984, and that has guided regulatory actions ever since. Let me see if I can explain it, and
Sure.
Listen to me carefully. Please correct me if I get anything wrong. My understanding is that the 1984 ruling established that on those occasions when laws passed by Congress leave something a little vague or muddy, whether by design or because circumstances change over time, when that happens, the courts were supposed to defer to federal agencies in determining how to enforce the law. The thinking was that these agencies were presumably staffed with people hired for their expertise and thus are most likely to make the best decisions. But as of Friday, the court has said, no, it shouldn't be the agencies who hold sway. It's up to judges to interpret the laws passed by Congress. Do I have that right?
Mostly, I think, and maybe you and I are going to say the same thing, but it's not just if it's vague or misguided or whatnot, but the Supreme Court basically ruled that their guidelines were that when Congress passes a law, it then hands that legislation down to the appropriate agency to implement and oversee that law, and they're being given the sort of the mandate and the authority to do that as long as it's in accordance with the law. And of course, as we all know, the law itself can be interpreted in different ways, but that's left up to the agency to decide. So perfect example, right? If we dig into like details. So this week, in fact, today, July 1st, there's a new rule, going into effect from the Department of Labor for overtime, right? So right now, if you're paying employees and they're salaried workers and they're making less than about $35,000, this is prior to today, and they meet other sort of requirements of classifications, they're not supervising people, they have certain titles, you don't have to pay them any overtime wages. Well, as of today, that number goes up. I forget what it goes up to, like 42,000 or something, and ultimately it goes up to $59,000 on January 1st of 2025. So what that means is that as an employer, you're paying more overtime to employees because the Department of Labor is lifting the wage level for which you can, you now have to, pay those employees overtime. Okay. So this is a Department of Labor rule, and it's under the Fair Labor Standards Act. That's the legislation. So Congress passes the Fair Labor Standards Act, which basically, sets out guidelines for making sure that people are paid fairly across, different industries and with different definitions. And then they turn to the Department of Labor to execute that law. And the Department of Labor determined years ago that overtime pay would qualify under this Fair Labor Standards Act. And therefore, it is their purview and their right to issue regulations, which are basically mandating employers to pay certain types of overtime wages depending on the circumstances. And right now, there's a there's a case in Texas that is appealing this and saying that this overtime rule goes above and beyond the Department of Labor's, authority. And now, because of last week's decision by the Supreme Court, which passes down these decisions to a judge, this gives the judge in Texas even that much more power to determine whether or not the Department of Labor even has the authority, if they're interpreting the Fair Labor Standards Act correctly, and they have the authority to increase overtime wage. I'm just using, by the way, one regulation, but it is they're determining whether or not the Department of Labor has the authority to do that. And it'll be the judge's decision. That's what the Supreme Court is saying. Whatever the judge decides, that's what, that's what the rule, the law is going to be. So it takes all of this sort of, execution of laws and interpretation of laws out of the agency's hands, and it puts it into the courts if there's any disputes. And because of that, I think it's going to have a wide-ranging effect on a lot of businesses all around the country. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And, some people are predicting chaos. I think some people, depending on your political leanings, are expecting that this will be a good thing for a lot of businesses, a lot of people who lean to the right. Let me throw the objection that I hear at you and see what you say. The objection, the reason why I think a lot of people toward the left side of the spectrum have been dreading this decision coming down is they believe it exchanges expertise for something pretty close to politics. The idea being that within the agency, you have people who, whose job it is to study these issues and come up with the best plan of implementation of the law that they can. Now, you may disagree with that, with what they do, but there are thousands of bureaucrats.
You realize I disagree with everything that you say, so of course I'm going to disagree with that too. But carry on.
Wait, you can't disagree with what I said. What I said was just factual in terms of why people on the left have been fearing this rule.
Right.
And it's certainly true. The agencies are staffed to deal with these issues. There are lots and lots of employees, like with the ruling you're talking about, whatever you feel about it, there were analyses done to try to determine what the right number was. At what level should the overtime kick in? Now, they may have gotten it wrong. I'm not making that argument, but I'm saying that there were people who did studies, looked at pay rates around the country, and tried to determine what the best number was to apply to the entire country. Obviously, that's a complicated thing to do. A judge in Texas doesn't have the staff to do that kind of analysis. So you might prefer the judge's opinion, but it's not based on the kind of expertise and analysis that you would want to have done for this kind of decision.
That does make a lot of sense, and you are correct in that analysis. I can't disagree with that. I was kidding before, but I will say that the supporters of the Supreme Court's decision, and I don't know if you want to say they're more on the right or more on the left or whatever, but they point to the fact that the overtime rule, increase, the overtime pay increase that we're looking at right now, is also politics, because it is, judges can be appointed for political reasons, but presidents get elected and they appoint their Secretary of Labor, like Julie Su, who's now the acting Secretary of Labor. And she is, pushing this rule change forward. And then, of course, telling her staff to do the calculations behind it. And, so that's being done for political reasons, because it's going towards the agenda of whatever administration is in power. For example, again, we're sticking with this overtime rule. The Obama administration tried to raise this overtime pay, if you remember, back from, it was this current level of 35,000 to about 47,000. Some judge, found reasons why they couldn't do that. The Obama administration appealed that case, and then the Trump administration took over and they just stopped the appeal process. So therefore, that's why the overtime wages stayed the same over all this period of time, because it wasn't being driven for a political agenda, So one other thing that I want to also point out about this, some people say that it will create uncertainty. And I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think John Ahrensmeyer, who is a listener of here, and he runs a great small business majority. I know him and I've talked to him before. And
he's been a guest on this podcast, a longtime friend of 21 Hats.
And I am a fan of his as well. So, I've always argued with him or, debated, and frankly, I believe the organization leans a little bit to the left. So, it tends to be the things that come out are generally towards supportive of, of say like a Biden administration, and he holds his member.
He argues otherwise, for the record,
That's
and
fine. That's fine.
and he will tell you that his membership leans a little bit toward the right. But go ahead.
I'm glad you're saying that in his defense. I really am glad, because I don't want to start any fights here. But I do want to say that he said just today they released a press release saying that it will create more uncertainty. I think he's absolutely right about that. I mean, there's no argument there.
Well, how could it not? It's changing the way that these things are going to be resolved.
100%. But not only that, it's like now, like every rule is in play.
Exactly.
So, and think about all these rules, even just under the Biden administration, but it can go back way before them. Think about just over the past few years, we've had changes in worker classifications. I just mentioned overtime rules. How about the National Labor Relations Board? All these, allowing a lot of union activities, rules around sexual and, racial discrimination from the EEOC, rules from OSHA. All of these now are subject to lawsuits. All of these rules that these agencies are doing, now people can take them to court, and the judge can decide whether or not it's under the agency's mandate to do something like this. And whether they interpreted the law correctly, and it will create uncertainty. There's no doubt about it.
You want to hear some irony about this?
Yeah, go ahead.
In the 1984 ruling that this overturns was actually a unanimous 6-0 decision written by a conservative appointee to the Supreme Court. At the time, that ruling was celebrated by conservatives because the courts were saying that Ronald Reagan's EPA should have the right to determine. I should say the court was saying, the Supreme Court issued this ruling saying that Ronald Reagan's EPA should have the right to determine how to enforce environmental laws or not enforce them. At that time, it was a victory for conservatives.
That is really funny. That really is. Well, listen, that was back in the day, right? So now we're talking about...
Things have changed since then. Agreed.
Yeah.
Do you know what the underlying case is for this one here? This is kind of interesting, too. The underlying case that has resulted in this being overturned now involves a herring boat that was based... I don't know if it's still running or not, but at the time that this all started, it was based in Cape May, New Jersey, not far from where you and I both live, a lovely town. The boat was required, a fishing boat, to take a government monitor out to sea to observe their fishing practices. And the owner of the boat didn't mind that, did not object to the monitor. The owner of the boat objected to being told he had to pay a fee for the monitor, and that fee was roughly equivalent to like a full salary. It was ridiculous. Right. And he was right to complain, clearly. And I don't know if it was his voice, but maybe it was the collective voice of other fishing boats. That voice was heard, and the decision was reversed. The fee was completely dropped. Any fees that were collected were refunded. So as this case has made its way up through the courts, there's essentially been no dispute because they didn't object to the monitor being there.
Right. Right. Understood. But the fee itself was yet another.
It was terrible. It was ridiculous.
Yeah. And it was another part of the rule from the agency. So it's whether, there's one part of the rule to have the monitor there, another part of the rule saying you're going to also have to pay. So it's all, again, it just all gets back to how much power do the agencies have? Do we live in an administrative state? Can the executive branch, how much power does that have over businesses to operate? And although there's going to be a lot of uncertainty, I mean, I think there will be some good things that come out of this. I mean, first of all, if you're a lawyer, you got to be really excited because it's going to create a lot more work for you.
That's not going to make anybody listening to this podcast happy. True.
But in addition to that, I mean, I think business groups themselves are going to be that much more active. I mean, God, the NFIB, the U.S. Chamber are going to go nuts, because they're the ones that are going to start these lawsuits and call a lot of this into question. What it might do, though, Loren, is, and maybe I'm being too naive here, but it might in the end cause government agencies to just write better regulations, to think them through more, to do that much more research on their end to determine whether or not they do have the authority and the mandate and they're implementing this law in the right way, all in advance, that there are we can avoid these lawsuits. And really it might turn out that some of these regulations that these agencies are doing. For example, overtime rules. Maybe that's above and beyond what their purview is, and maybe it's determined that they can't regulate what businesses pay.
I don't know. Somebody has to determine that. Who should determine it?
Well, I mean, the determination might be to do nothing at all. I mean, and again, you might have a Department of Labor that is like, you know what, based on court rulings and based on what we're seeing now in this new environment, maybe we really can't mess around with overtime rules anymore because it's not within our mandate.
Just let the market decide. No minimum wage.
Yeah. And I got news for you. I spoke to a handful of clients just today who are thrilled about that direction because they don't want to see mandates coming down from the federal government to force them to pay their employees more in overtime, to force them into minimum wage, to force them into mandated time off and all those things. If it's not part of the Department of Labor's, if they're overextending their authority when it comes to the Fair Labor Standards Act, and they can't do that kind of stuff anymore, what business owners are going to complain about that? I'm not saying that doesn't create other issues for employees in the workplace and all that, but as a business owner, how's that a bad thing for me?
Well, I kind of agree with you more than you might think there. I think a lot of these laws are real. I hate to say it, but a lot of these laws are really aimed at large corporations, and sometimes small businesses get caught in the crossfire, and they're not the ones that really need to bear the brunt of this. And that's really unfortunate. But the other side of that is, and I think this is what John Arensmeyer of Small Business Majority was getting at, some of these regulations are designed to protect small businesses from large corporations. And his concern, and I think he may be right about this, is that this may make that more difficult. And, an example of that might be regulation on a marketplace like Amazon and how it treats small merchants that sell in that marketplace, whether or not it should be allowed to rip off their products or, do the other things that Amazon has been accused of doing.
I guess there's some examples of that, and then there's some examples of not. I mean, getting back to the one, like the overtime rule, for example, I don't see how that benefits small businesses. I mean, if you're forced to pay people overtime, I mean, if your larger counterparts are already doing that anyway because they can afford it, why am I being forced to do it? It's not helping me, and it does get back to that marketplace issue, saying, why aren't we letting businesses determining their own how they compensate their employees, whether it's minimum wage, overtime, paid time off? I mean, you're running a business. It's not. The final thing is that, and this is, some people believe that it's a federalist point of view. Should the federal government be involved in this at all? If you want to have rules regarding overtime pay, for example, should that be a state thing or a federal thing? Like, how much authority should the federal government have, and how much should be left to the states who theoretically know their own locals? That's the questions that it raises.
Well, you can go back in time and look at what the world looked like before some of these laws existed, child labor laws, for example, and get a sense of where we might be if this were all completely thrown out and we just operated by the marketplace. I don't know. I don't have I don't have a lot of hopes for that world.
No, I think the point that you bring up is good, but it's there's just checks and balances that need to happen. Obviously, things like extremes, like child labor laws. How about safety rules? I mean, do you think we should abolish OSHA? I don't think anybody's saying that we should be abolishing these agents.
Well, you came close to saying it there. I mean, not that you said it literally, but the implication of what you were saying of let the marketplace determine kind of said it.
Well, I think it should be, and I'll throw in the government marketplace part of this. I think that legislation needs to drive what businesses do. Legislation, not rules that are made up by whatever political person is in office at any given time. So to use OSHA as an example, just, or no, let's use the overtime rule as an example. If the people feel, if Congress believes that overtime rules should be, overtime pay should be increased, or there needs to be a formula for it, there should be a law to do that. And then it's cut and dry. That's just what the law is. But what they're doing right now is they're leaving it up to a political arm, which is what these agencies are, depending on who's in office, to determine what these rules are. And, I think the ruling from the Supreme Court is basically saying it's got to be law. It's got to be law.
I understand the appeal of that. The trick there is that you said before that you need, maybe this will encourage better writing of regulations. Maybe what we really need is better writing of laws. But that's a problem because you can't foresee every possibility, especially over time. Laws tend to stay on the books for a very long period of time. The world changes, and somebody has to do that interpretation. And I still would rather have a room full of experts who've dedicated their careers to a particular topic. And I understand you're right. There is political influence in that world as well, than a judge. Let me ask you this. Does it bother you at all that two of the justices on the Supreme Court who voted with a majority on this have taken millions of dollars in undisclosed gifts from the kinds of people who supported and brought this litigation?
Yeah, it does bother me. And what bothers me the most is the lack of judgment by somebody sitting on the Supreme Court that would do something like that. When people that you put in a position of trust behave in that way, it really does call into question whether or not you can believe anything they do. But I will say that the Supreme Court themselves, because they've ruled just in the past few weeks on quite a few different cases that were in favor of the Biden administration, that were against what some of the Republicans wanted. And the Supreme Court itself, I mean, I think you do take your job seriously when you're a Supreme Court justice. I think you are trying to evaluate each case as it relates to the Constitution. I do think they're professionals, but I do have to admit though, Loren, man, when I see them doing stuff like that, it burns me up. It really does.
We agree on something else. Gene, what are you working on? Anything we should look for this week?
Yeah, what am I writing this week, Loren? I am going to write about the Chevron case for the Inquirer, and a lot of it's going to be part of what what this conversation was all about. So that's going to be my.
Feel free to quote me.
Yeah, should I quote you on this? Is there like to get you involved?
Sure.
I will try. It's more of an advice case, and it's more like, what do you do? I mean, I'm going to use that overtime ruling as an example because in all of this, all these conversations that we're having about this, Loren, it's all fine from an academic level, but come on, man, you're running a business. You're like, all right, so now what the fuck do I do? Do you know what I mean? Like this thing is out there. Now all these rules are in play. Do I follow the rules? Do I not? What rule is effective? I have clients right now that are like, these overtime rules go into effect today, but now I'm hearing that, this case in Texas is going to stop them. And now it's bolstered by the Supreme Court decision. So should I even be complying? Yep. What do I do? That gets back to John Ahrensmeyer's, it creates uncertainty. It really does. And so I'm going to try and offer some thoughts. I talked to a couple of attorneys as to what to do. That's what I'll be writing about.
Cool. I will look forward to that. Gene Marks is a CPA who writes weekly on small business for The Guardian, The Hill, The Philadelphia Inquirer, The Washington Times, The Chicago Daily Herald, Forbes, and Entrepreneur. You can also hear him on ABC Radio's Eye on the World with John Batchelor. Gene hosts 2 small business podcasts with Paychex Corporation and The Hartford. This episode was brought to you by The Great Game of Business, which helps businesses use an open book management system to help build healthier companies. You can learn more at greatgame.com. Thank you, Gene.
Thank you, Loren. Talk to you soon.
Have a great week, everybody.